Well, good afternoon. I got as a part-time professor, they allowed me to wander, so I will do that, not just to try to keep you awake, but to engage on what I think is an exciting set of topics, one that certainly are crossing some boundaries, maybe challenging some notions of what's an appropriate partner, but I think that's part of what this conversation is about in light of the challenges that we face. So I'm coming, I had a very short commute compared to some of our speakers and participants. I'm here in town at the Woodrow Wilson Center. As Cynthia said, we are a nonpartisan forum. I think most important in this context, we've been lucky to have Catherine Fuller in residence as a scholar, and that's been a real privilege for us, as it is, as we have 50 at any given time, 50 scholars at any time, to facilitate conversations between the worlds of scholarship and policy. Wilson happened to be our only president with a PhD. And so Congress set up the Wilson Center as a formal memorial to recognize that, where these worlds can come together. So let's jump into the question of conservation and security linkages. It requires that we check some stereotypes at the door, so to speak, that the different groups, the different communities hold about each other. We have some very different objectives, obviously some very different tools, some of them being more effective, some of them being quite a bit less effective. But I start presentations to communities, no matter kind of where they're sitting, with this admonition or plea, really. And it's born out of some experience that I had that I didn't realize in some ways how deeply held they are. So about 10 years ago, we had a program up at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and I was driving up with the head of an NGO, international NGO, but based here in the U.S., focusing on health and development and environmental issues, and she whispered to me, she said, "Geoff, we're on a military base. I don't think my family will let me come back home." Yeah, and I said, "Well, why? You're agreeing to participate in this. This is the whole point. We want to get you in what was a scenario and simulation exercise to walk in other people's shoes." What was interesting, of course, the assumptions went the other way as well, where the view of those interested in conservation, environment, natural resources issues were that it's just a bunch of tree huggers that aren't serious. In the words of one of our ambassadors participating. But by the end of it, it was the quote, I won't get it exactly right, but you know, you tree huggers aren't all that bad. You're actually pretty serious people too. And so this is what we have to find our way past in order to have these conversations. I do not want to, from the very outset, I am not suggesting there aren't really hardcore trade-offs between conservation goals and a variety of ways. The security community is a very diverse community, but some of the mechanisms, the means, the tools do present real challenges, such as sonar and beaching of whales. And I use this as one. We can have many different elements of those hardcore trade-offs. I'm not suggesting they're not there, but part of this is about a conversation about how we cross some of these boundaries. And there's really a history of it. We know our common future. The important report that Gru Harlem Brundtland chaired as the kind of blueprint for our '92 Earth Summit in Rio. It came out in '87, and so we know it for sustainable development, but there's a chapter on environment and security there that highlighted a number of these trade-offs, but also saw some possible ways to go forward together and understand that there were some connections that, whether we liked them or not, they couldn't be broken, and we had to find ways to address them. Clearly, there are big imbalances in terms of the resources that these different communities have. And I think it would be fair to say that we probably all would have a different calculus that we would prefer. But unfortunately, in this realm, to me, too often, this is the end of the presentation. Well, they have the money, we don't, we want it, give it to us, and then you don't go any farther. If they just pick up 1% and put it over here, we're in Washington, that's not a particularly realistic kind of description of how things work, but it's often what then cuts off the conversation. And so I'm going to have a few more slides to suggest how we can have what are interesting, challenging conversations that are us trying to find ways to minimize threats and maximize opportunities. So let's continue the conversation and find ways to act across these boundaries. So a couple examples to walk through. ironically, biodiversity flourishes in places where people aren't. People aren't on military bases. They aren't particularly active in conflict zones. They aren't in demilitarized zones. And I know a number of you are active in some of the collaboration and cooperation with, say, military authorities in this country, looking at places where in some cases it's the only place some of these species are occurring. It's meant to be an example that in some ways makes this, it's counterintuitive. It's certainly, we're not prescribing conflict in order to protect biodiversity, right? But nevertheless, it's a reality that we want to find ways to embrace, to have conversations, and to take advantage of some of these. I added the reducing energy consumption footprint. This is one that until maybe 18 months ago would not appear in this, because frankly, at least the US Defense Department wasn't taking it terribly seriously. What has changed has been in part because of the perception of cost, but even more importantly, the variety of benefits that can come by thinking in a more conservation, conserving, efficiency perspective, and getting really serious and hopefully driving some of the technologies that will help in other sectors in terms of energy, both more efficient use of fossil fuels and more importantly, renewables. What commonly comes to the top and what people assume that an environment and security presentation is about the relationship between environment, natural resources, and violent conflict. That is part of the story. Please don't see it as the only part of the story, only the whole story. In some ways, I mean, as we manage natural resources, we're engaging in conflict resolution, right? It may become at all different levels of conflict. We may have very developed institutions for negotiating those disagreements about how we use, conserve resources. But so in some ways, we're doing this all the time. But when we're talking about higher levels of violence around it, it's highly complex, very situation-specific. Nevertheless, to make a very broad generalization in this, there are problems now, and the concern is that because of environmental change, growth in population, growth in consumption, and then the fact that these resources are distributed inequitably, the concern is this will become a bigger issue in the future. Throw on top of that the issue of climate change, and we could have a whole discussion in terms of the climate and security realm. I think to be very quick on it, I would say the challenge is that it is going to, as we've seen, make so many of these challenges harder to deal with. Increased variability, undercutting capacities, heightening vulnerabilities. And so in this way, for, say, the bottom bullet there, we're not talking about a unique kind of conflict, but it's going to make some of these issues more challenging, and hence the notion of a threat multiplier rather than a whole new field of study itself. At the same time, in this realm, and security, and I'm not just talking about the military, we could go up to New York and the UN and the folks who are responsible for facilitating negotiations to end conflict, so the diplomats. Too often, issues of natural resources are viewed as luxury items, as what you worry about once you get rich, democratic, and peaceful, not as critical to the livelihoods in a development context, as Cynthia pointed out ahead of time. I think we are making progress in breaking down that notion of these issues as luxury items, in part because we are seeing more and more how vulnerable and susceptible so many people are to variation and access to those resources. But that there are also then real opportunities for making it quite clear that these are critical to getting economies going, agriculture going, and getting people to buy into the peace. And so if you settle a conflict by inviting the one party to the table by promising the forestry ministry, knowing that they're going to just use that to enrich themselves, then that's not a sustainable peace. That the resources have to be at the table as a top tier issue and not as a secondary tier issue. Those are the kinds of things we have to achieve by engaging those communities in dialogue from a conservation perspective and natural resource perspective. And in that, I hesitate to call it a field because it's small and we have a lot of work to do. But under a rubric or an umbrella that we're calling environmental peace building, we have systematic efforts to try to find ways to take advantage of those very interdependencies around resources, to break those links with conflict, and find additional rationale for long-term cooperation. The map there is a proposed peace park between Israel and Jordan that is both focused on biodiversity in terms of it being a major flyway, providing local opportunity in terms of some sustainable tourism and such. These are conversations that really require talking to a lot of folks and getting outside of our silos and stovepipes of what we think of as conservation, what we think of as peace and conflict resolution. And whether we call it a peace park or not, to me, some of that semantic, sometimes we don't want to load up transboundary conservation with that additional expectation. It's hard to do whether you're trying to build peace between partners or not. But these patterns of cooperation offer opportunities that can realize benefits in the conservation side and in the peace building side. Some unusual folks are doing this. This notion of environmental dialogue or scientific inquiry as a lifeline for dialogue when things are uncertain. We have some prominent examples where the US military has participated in. At times, this is where you have to weigh the trade-offs. At times, environment is a means to a security end, and that can pose some real challenges and questions about whether that's a productive means to pursue it, whether it's just being used for some other purposes. But at the same time, some of these present very real challenges in the environmental realm that progress is made. So the US, Norway, Russian, and Russian Northwest, that was assessing the threats of radioactive contamination from the Russian Northwest. And as part of that, we found out things like the scuttling of the Russian submarines by just sinking them with their nuclear reactors on board. So there's progress to be made in engaging in these conversations. While we can agree in the larger context, they may have some big trade-offs. A tactical example. So if we're looking at Indonesian deforestation, and we're looking at the variety of actors you have to engage in if you want to address that problem. One of them is certainly the Indonesian military as owner of those forests, as logging legally and illegally. That's a difficult conversation to, if you're an international NGO or a local NGO, it's difficult to get standing, so to speak, to have that conversation in a way that might move the dial with a strategy that is not strictly a protest strategy. We have some example of convincing, in part because of the threat of what deforestation may mean for larger Indonesian development and stability questions, examples of engaging the US military in its ongoing military-to-military conversation with the Indonesians, and introducing these issues as longer-term concerns about what are the sources of national wealth, what is the value of rule of law that has larger questions of interest to the stability and the security community that are also some of those same institutions that we're interested in from a conservation perspective. Finally, finding ways to cross boundaries. We talk about different tools and some different objectives between these communities, but I would posit that there are some similarities that we don't often, we may kind of recognize but don't often pay attention to, and certainly don't take enough advantage of how parallel they are. If you're a security planner and you're trying to figure out where the next conflict is going to break out and how you're going to train, procure, and deploy, you're going to take a precautionary principle or risk analysis approach to that. You're not certain. You have to make important allocations of resources and decisions in the face of uncertain information, and you're going to use a risk analysis frame. On climate change, anyway, where we're often told no action until we have certainty in science, I would suggest that whole precautionary principle that we have so integral to environmental regulation and response is analogous in ways that have some tools of scenario and gaming and such that allow for a dialogue, that allows for some similarity of tools that we can really learn from one another and find ways to help mutually advance some of the interests. I put this CNA Military Advisory Board, and this is the kind of header from their report. Retired General Sullivan, 4-star Army general, in part encapsulated this in his kind of typical brusque manner, which said, on the battlefield, if you wait around for certain information to make decisions, bad things happen. In climate change, civilians, why wouldn't that be the same? His message was largely to Congress. You can't sit around and defer action until you have absolute certainty, the notion that you could even ever have it. But nevertheless, these are conversations that are both substantively parallel, but also, and so in that kind of strategic sense, but also tactically, if we're looking for different messengers, unexpected messengers for having these conversations, I think there's ripe ground there. Finally, just a couple slides on some examples around climate change that would suggest why we need to find ways to minimize threats, maximize opportunities that come from the dialogue between these different communities, and get out of our silos in order to do that. Requires it. And that is, in some sense, not focusing on does climate cause conflict, but taking a hard look at the different ways we respond to climate change, do now and hopefully will in the future, and go in with our eyes open to minimize the potential that conflict may be created by those interventions, those responses, and maximize the benefits that could come for adaptation, for development, for peace building, that come from either mitigation or adaptation. So these are the ways then it becomes a challenge, but also the opportunity to capture these co-benefits that could come from investing in some of the same institutions we're going to try to lower their vulnerability, increase their resilience for adaptation purposes that would also have benefits in a conflict-affected country, for example. So I have a couple lists of different ways that we should think about. So if we're moving to renewables, moving away from fossil fuels, the biofuels example, I'll just mention a couple years ago, the European Union took the strong action of saying by 2020 we're going to be 10% renewables. Terrific. Palm oil prices, however, double. The accelerated deforestation on the other side of the earth and the social conflict that's accompanied that. Unintended impacts of trying to do right by climate. Now, there are lots of reasons why there are food riots and the price spikes in 08 and 09. But these are the kinds of things that we need to think through, and dialogue across those communities are ways that can help us do that. This is a little hard to see. This is a map of China with current and planned dams. Hydro is obviously one alternative energy source on the mitigation side, but also an adaptation tool. What does that mean for downstream? And our security community here in the United States are asking questions like, does this mean, when does Cambodia only get one rice harvest instead of two? What does that mean for livelihoods, food security, and then the broader conservation investments? How does Cynthia and her colleagues at AID, how do they integrate these kinds of transboundary elements into their calculations, how they make investments? I put REDD+ up there and talk about that in the context of really, it's terrific. We got to find ways to put value on those ecosystem services to try to keep those trees standing. But we're talking about changing access to resources and introducing money into uncertain political contexts and who gets it for what. That can be done well, and that can be done poorly. And if you're talking to the folks in the conflict community, that's often the formula or an inflection point for where conflict is potential. We have to go in with our eyes open and have those dialogues be broad enough to consider those possibilities and do it in ways that are respectful and take advantage of that really innovative direction. So in this sense, a couple words on where we are. I do think there's some ongoing dialogues now among, grouping them broadly, a natural resources conservation environment, climate, community, although there's some diversity in that one, right? Development, as well as peace building and security. So some of those conversations are going on. There's a recognition that we need to do this. One example might be the development or ongoing development of trying to say, okay, as we're making a new range and trying to, what's an adaptation intervention? What kinds of things are we supporting? Having at our disposal ways to ask systematic questions for how do we make sure this is conflict sensitive and we're not unintentionally creating some other problems either for ourselves or for other communities that may be physically quite remote from it. And then, again, some new research, and again, with Cynthia being the chair, I'll point out AID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation working with the other parts of AID to look at, okay, how do we, in fact, we had a meeting on it this week. We're looking in West Africa, and how do you do climate adaptation in West Africa that is advancing development goals and avoiding conflict and capturing some peace-building benefits. That's the kind of research that is both scientific. We had the Tyndall Center scientists coming in via VATC, but also field-based. We had the peace-building NGO folks coming in from West Africa to talk about their interviews at the community level. Those are the kinds of partnerships that we need to find a way to do. So finally, given the level of stress that our natural systems are under, given the level of dysfunction that our political systems are exhibiting, to me it suggests that it's a call for all hands on deck. And while we are challenged at times because of some of the trade-offs offered from the perspectives of these different communities, both the tools they have and the objectives that they have, nevertheless, I think there are ways that these issues are intertwined in meaningful ways, so we leave important stakeholders or actors out of the room if we don't engage them, and that we also leave some opportunities that we could capture if we had sustained dialogue to better understand those mindsets, those tools, those objectives, minimize their negative impacts, and try to maximize capturing those opportunities. So thank you all very much. Look forward to the conversation.